I was asked today about Buddhism and how come I talk about it, and it's part of my philosophy, but I've never talked about the end of suffering or the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path, which are the key principles of Buddhism. And the truth is, I've commented a little bit about Buddhism, but I've never really gone into detail, or probably enough detail in any of the traditions. So now's a good time to start exploring how this works and the actual philosophy behind the Buddhist tradition, and what it's good for and who it's good for. So, suffering. The first of the Four Noble Truths is there is suffering. Now we can take this in the traditional Buddhist way, and it's an explanation, it's an answer about life. There is suffering in life. Here's what the suffering is. But I find it's more interesting to look at it as a question. Is there suffering? Is there suffering in your life? What is that suffering? Where is the suffering in your life? And you might come up with very different answers to other people, and maybe even different answers to yourself on another day. So I could answer this, where is the suffering in my life? It's suffering to do with being too sensitive to all of my feelings and emotions. Or on another day I could say, or somebody might say, my suffering is that I don't have enough cornflakes and I run out of cornflakes in the morning. You know, little things, big things. So Buddhism is particularly focused on the interpretation of suffering that's based on sickness, sickness, death, and I've forgotten completely, something to do with grief maybe. Anyway, it looks at that there are certain sufferings that happen in every person's life, and there are always disappointments and there are always issues. But let's have a look at what your sufferings are and what you feel there is a need for in your life. And that's what drives you towards your personal spiritual path. The second of the Four Noble Truths is there is a reason for the suffering. So let's ask that as a question too. What is the reason for that suffering? If I say that my suffering is sensitivity to emotions, then is my suffering perhaps caused by being a very sensitive person? Or is it perhaps caused by not having enough emotional maturity? If my suffering is that I don't have enough cornflakes, is perhaps my suffering caused by not buying enough cornflakes when I go to the shop? In the traditional Buddhist answer, everything is interpreted as caused by desire. So when we desire and need things too much, then there is always disappointments. If we have high expectations, then we are never meeting those expectations. So these expectations, needs to receive things from the world are the things that cause the suffering, because without those needs we would be able to enjoy some aspect of each moment. And that's an interpretation that's quite a profound one and can be taken to great depth. So you can choose whether to take that deepest desire as the cause of suffering, or whether to look at a shallower area, a shallower way of looking at it, or even a different way of looking at it. So let's have a look at the next one. So if we have desire, we have a reason for the suffering. The next point is there is an end to the suffering. Yes, there's an end to the suffering. So we have suffering, we have a reason for suffering. Is there an end to suffering? What would the end of the suffering be? If it's about cornflakes, then the end of the suffering would be to have always a steady supply of cornflakes that's enough so that you can have as much cornflakes as you want. If it's about emotional maturity, then perhaps the end of the suffering is to be emotionally mature enough to be able to handle any emotions. If it's about desire, as in the traditional Buddhist description, then the end of suffering is to be free of desire, to not have needs and desires, but to accept things as they are, to accept each moment as it is. So this is what's often defined as enlightenment, because it's that end point that we're looking for in our practice. So if you look at it in this way as questions rather than as a particular answer, and this is the Buddhist approach, look at it as personal questions for yourself, then you get also a personal type of enlightenment. What am I looking for in this moment? What would make my life better? And some people come up with very different answers. So what would it be like when I ended this suffering? I've heard people say that they would, miracles would happen and the lights would turn green when they drove up to them. I've heard people say they would find meaning in life and not necessarily happiness. Others say they would be blissfully happy all the time. Some even talk about power, that I would have the ability to make a difference in the world. So different kinds of approaches that you can take. So then, talking of approaches, we then have the pathway. The fourth noble truth is there is a path to this end of suffering. So what is this path to the end of suffering? If we know that the end of suffering is there's plenty of cornflakes every week, a steady supply of cornflakes, then the path to that end of suffering is to make sure cornflakes is on the shopping list and that you go shopping every week and that you buy a very large packet so that there's plenty of cornflakes. If the suffering is about emotional maturity and where the end of suffering is to be so emotionally mature that I'm not affected by any emotions, then the pathway would be something to do with learning and dealing with all of my emotions. If the pathway is to do with the end of desire, then we need to look at focusing on the contentment of the moment so that we're not focusing on the desire and building desires, and we're focusing on something that can take us away from desire and need. And so that would be the Buddhist meditation on awareness and contentment. So it's an interesting way you can look at the Four Noble Truths as questions in your own life, or you can also take them in that traditional way as an analysis of desire and the end of desire and therefore the end of suffering, which is the approach that Buddhist meditation takes.